The courtyard air vibrated with the low hum of an engine, and a mother kept her eyes locked on the soldier's lips, terrified he might speak another child's name. Just one name wrong, and the hope she carried would be sent back into waiting, empty-handed. Sometimes waiting hurts more than losing. I remember noticing how still everything felt in that moment, like the world itself was holding its breath. Her hands were clasped so tightly that the skin around her knuckles had turned pale, yet she didn't seem to feel it. Without realizing it, her thumb kept rubbing the frayed edge of the fabric she was holding, over and over, as if checking that it was still real. She was listening for a sound that could either mend her life or quietly break it all over again. Slow moments like this stretch longer than hours. They leave room for every fear to speak. She had learned to read silence the way others read letters. Silence meant days without news. Silence meant nights counting footsteps that never came. And now, in this small courtyard, silence felt heavier than it ever had before. The soldier stood straight, careful with his posture, careful with his words, as if he understood that one breath too many could change everything. The smell of oil from the engine mixed with damp stone, grounding the moment in something painfully real. She thought about the last time she had held her child's coat. It had felt thinner than she remembered. She suddenly recalled how, just before everything fell apart, the child had pointed out a loose button, tugging at the stitching and asking why it wasn't fixed yet. She had smiled then and said she'd take care of it later. Later had come and gone so many times that it no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a story she kept telling herself to survive. Back then, people believed that if you stayed strong long enough, things would return to how they were. But strength doesn't stop time. It only teaches you how to stand while it moves on. Around her, other mothers waited too, each wrapped in their own quiet rituals, fingers counting, eyes closed, lips moving in prayers that never found words. For a brief moment, she caught herself thinking that one of them looked more hopeful than the others, and the thought immediately filled her with shame. No one spoke. No one dared to. Speaking would make the moment real, and reality was something they approached slowly like thin ice. The soldier shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly, and the sound felt louder than it should have. Every small noise carried meaning now. She wondered if she would recognize her child's voice if she heard it again. Would it sound older? Would it sound unfamiliar? The thought made her throat tighten, and she swallowed hard, forcing the questions away. Hope feels fragile when you stare at it too closely. So she focused on the soldier's mouth again, on the shape of the next word forming on the space between one breath and the next. And as that word hovered, unspoken, something began to change, not just in her, but in everyone standing there. Her breath caught halfway in, refusing to finish until she knew what would come next. Because this was the moment when waiting either ends or learns how to last a little longer. If stories like this matter to you, and you believe quiet moments deserve to be remembered, you're in the right place. This is history captured, and there's more waiting just ahead. The moment before had frozen her in place, listening for a word that could decide everything. To understand why that word carried so much weight, you have to go back to when waiting first learned her name. Before the separation, life had been ordinary in the quietest ways. Mornings came with small negotiations, coats tugged on too slowly, a child insisting on fastening a button without help, her hands hovering nearby, torn between patience and the rush to get moving. She used to smooth their hair quickly, promising she'd fix it properly later. Ordinary moments like these never announce that they're about to become precious. When the streets grew louder and movement became unavoidable, choices stopped feeling like choices at all. They turned into reactions. Her arms tightened instinctively, as if strength alone could anchor a small body in place. But crowds don't pause for instincts. Noise swallows names. And once hands slip apart, distance multiplies faster than anyone expects. She remembered shouting, though the sound of her own voice never stayed with her. It felt like calling out underwater, mouth open, lungs burning but nothing breaking the surface. People pushed past her, each carrying their own urgency. Someone stumbled. Someone cried. She grabbed an unfamiliar sleeve by mistake and let go just as quickly, embarrassed and breathless, telling herself it wasn't her child she'd heard crying. She had to believe that to keep moving. There was a moment, small, cruel, and impossible to forget, when she had to decide whether to keep searching the crowd or follow the direction she'd been told to go. Standing still felt dangerous. Moving felt worse. She followed the flow, and even as her feet obeyed, a single thought cut through everything else. If I had waited just one more second. That thought would return later, uninvited, whenever the nights grew too quiet. Days blurred together after that. Questions were asked. Answers arrived half-formed. Names were written down carefully, then rewritten, as if neatness might help them stick. Each night ended the same way, with her staring at the empty space where a small body used to sleep. She still caught herself setting aside a place before realizing there was no one to fill it. Old habits don't disappear just because reality changes. People told her to be patient. They said children were resilient. They said many families would be reunited soon. She nodded because that's what you do when words don't land where they're meant to. Inside, patience felt less like virtue and more like endurance. Reassurance didn't quiet a mind that replayed every step it wished it could retrace. She clung to objects because memories felt too fragile on their own. A button, a scrap of fabric, one lone sock that never found its pair, folded and unfolded again, unable to be thrown away for reasons she couldn't explain. These were small acts, almost invisible, but they were her way of saying, I'm still here. I'm still waiting. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the waiting had shaped others too, in places far beyond her sight. Somewhere else, a child was learning how to carry absence in smaller hands. That part of the story was unfolding quietly, just out of reach, and it was moving closer than she realized. The waiting didn't belong to her alone. While she counted days and clutched memories, someone else was learning how to live inside the same absence. The child's world had become smaller, quieter, and harder to understand. Days were marked by routines that didn't feel like home, meals eaten when told, beds shared with strangers, names spoken in accents that felt wrong in the mouth. There were moments of kindness, yes, but kindness without familiarity can still feel cold, especially to a child who's trying to remember where they came from. Some memories stayed sharp. The way a hand once squeezed theirs before letting go. A voice calling their name in a tone no one else used. Other memories blurred, slipping away no matter how tightly they were held. That scared them more than hunger or loneliness. Forgetting felt like a second loss. So they held onto small things instead. A rhythm of a song, the shape of a doorway, the idea that someone somewhere was still looking. At night, sleep came unevenly. Dreams mixed past and present until waking felt like stepping into the wrong room. Sometimes the child woke up convinced that today would be the day everything made sense again. Other times they woke already tired, already guarded. Children learn quickly how to adapt. They learn how to stop asking questions when answers don't come. Adults around them spoke carefully, choosing words the way you handle fragile glass. They said things would be sorted out. They said names were being checked. They said patience was important. The child would nod without meeting their eyes and once, just once, started to ask a question, then swallowed it as if the words had suddenly become too heavy. But patience is a strange thing to ask of someone who measures time in heartbeats instead of calendars. Waiting didn't feel noble. It felt endless. There were moments, quiet, unexpected ones, when hope slipped in without permission. A familiar sound in a hallway. A smell that reminded them of somewhere safe. Those moments hurt almost as much as they healed because hope always carried the risk of disappointment. Still, the child couldn't help it. Hope has a way of finding cracks even in the most guarded hearts. What they didn't know was how many people were involved in this waiting, how many hands moved papers, how many eyes scanned lists, how many decisions were made quietly without ceremony that nudged the future one step closer to change. From the child's view, none of that mattered yet. All that mattered was the feeling that something was missing, and the stubborn belief that missing didn't mean gone forever. As days turned into something harder to name, that belief was tested again and again. And just when it seemed like the world might stay this way, someone made a choice that shifted the weight of the waiting. The child gripped their small bag a little tighter than before, not knowing why, only sensing that something had begun to move. That choice would soon bring others into the story, people whose paths were about to cross with purpose, not by accident. The story didn't change because of luck. It changed because a few people decided not to look away. The soldiers weren't trained for this part. They knew how to follow orders, how to keep moving, how to stay alert. But no manual explained what to do when paperwork started to feel heavier than a rifle, or when a child's silence followed you longer than the echo of boots. Somewhere along the way, duty blurred into something personal. At first, it was small. A pause before turning a page. An extra glance at a name that felt familiar. One soldier found himself folding a letter the same careful way his mother used to, then stopped, surprised by his own hands. These weren't heroic acts. They were quiet decisions made in narrow hallways and crowded offices where the air smelled of dust and ink. But quiet decisions have a way of stacking up. There were risks in caring too much. Time was limited. Resources were thin, and emotions could cloud judgment. Still, something about the waiting on both sides made inaction feel heavier than any mistake. A thought kept returning, uninvited and unsettling. If this were my own. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it lingered long enough to change how carefully names were read. Conversations happened late after the official work was done. Voices lowered, doors closed. Someone would say, "What if we try one more list?" And someone else would nod, already thinking the same thing. It wasn't rebellion. It was responsibility reshaped by empathy. They began to see patterns others missed. Names written differently, ages that didn't quite line up, memories that didn't match records but matched feelings. Each discovery added weight to the process but also direction. For the first time, waiting felt like it was moving somewhere. None of them spoke about it openly. They understood the fragility of hope. Say too much too soon and it could shatter. So they let actions speak quietly instead. A file moved closer to the top. A meeting requested. A decision delayed just long enough to gather one more piece of truth. What they didn't realize was how close everything was becoming. How threads pulled from different directions were starting to meet in the middle. The search had stopped being abstract. It had a shape now. A direction. And somewhere a name was about to be spoken aloud, not as a question but as an answer. The search didn't move in a straight line. It circled, stalled, and doubled back on itself more times than anyone could count. Files were stacked, unstacked, then stacked again in different orders. Names appeared with slight changes, one letter missing here, an extra mark there. Dates refused to line up cleanly. Every small inconsistency felt like both a setback and an invitation. A setback because it slowed everything down. An invitation because it suggested something human hiding beneath the paperwork. For the mothers, waiting took on a new shape. It wasn't just empty time anymore. It was filled with visits, questions, and the careful repetition of details they feared getting wrong. How tall was the child when you last saw them? Which hand did they favor? Was there a scar? When she tried to answer one of those questions, she paused too long, then gave a careful estimate anyway, as if guessing out loud might somehow betray the memory. Each answer carried weight. Each answer reopened something tender. Still, they spoke. Because speaking meant the search was alive. Hope rose and fell without warning. One day, a hint of progress would send hearts racing. The next, a dead end would pull everything back into stillness. Some nights ended with relief. Others ended with the familiar ache of disappointment. Through it all, a single thought kept returning. Stopping would mean accepting this as the ending. And that was something none of them were ready to do. The soldiers felt it too. Fatigue crept in quietly, not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles in the shoulders and stays there. Yet even that couldn't outweigh the sense that they were getting closer. Pieces were beginning to fit, not perfectly, but enough to suggest a picture forming. One afternoon, a detail surfaced that refused to be ignored. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden announcement, just a pause. A look exchanged between two people who both felt the same shift. No words, no signal, only that shared glance that said, "This one holds." Something about this line, this name, this memory, it stayed. It didn't slide away like the others had. They didn't celebrate. They didn't speak it aloud. Experience had taught them caution. Instead, they checked it again. Then once more. They traced it backward, then forward, testing it from every angle they knew. With each pass, the possibility grew steadier, heavier, more real. Word traveled carefully, passed from one person to another without urgency, without spectacle. Preparations began quietly. A place was arranged. Instructions were simplified. Expectations were lowered on purpose. Everyone involved understood the risk of imagining too much. And yet, despite all that restraint, something changed. The waiting, long, exhausting, relentless waiting began to feel different. It wasn't shrinking, but it was narrowing. Somewhere between a question and an answer, the story leaned forward. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was about to break. The silence had been narrowing, pressing in from all sides, until it felt like even a breath might crack it open. And then, without ceremony, it finally did. The name was spoken softly, almost carefully, as if volume alone could undo what had taken so long to hold together. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother didn't react right away. Her mind lagged behind her ears, needing an extra second to believe the sound belonged to her. It felt safer to assume she'd misheard than to let hope rush in too fast. Her knees weakened before her thoughts caught up. She reached out instinctively, not falling, just grounding herself in the nearest solid thing. The soldier stayed close, watching for a sign, ready to step in if the weight of the moment tipped too far. But no words came. None were needed yet. Across the courtyard, the child stopped short. One step forward, then a pause. They looked to the side as if checking for permission from a world that had taught them caution. Running had led to disappointment before. So they stood still, searching faces, waiting for something that felt certain enough to trust. Recognition didn't arrive like a wave. It came quietly, a tilt of the head, a familiar way of holding the shoulders. The mother saw it then, not a memory resurfacing, but something unmistakably present. She moved first, slowly, leaving space with every step. The child mirrored her, matching her pace without realizing it. When they reached each other, there was no sudden embrace. A hand lifted, then hesitated. Fingers trembled, hovering just long enough to ask a question without words. The child reached out first, curling small fingers around hers before letting the rest of the hand follow. That was all it took. Breath broke free. Tears came without warning. Years of waiting collapsed into a single, fragile touch. The soldier turned away, giving them room. Others did the same. This wasn't a moment meant to be watched closely. It was meant to be respected. The reunion wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Names were spoken again, this time with certainty, not to confirm, but to belong. The child tested the sound, repeating it softly as if learning a word they'd almost lost. The mother answered, voice unsteady but sure, anchoring it in place. Even in the relief, there was weight. Reunions don't erase what came before. They sit beside it. Joy and grief, closeness and distance, both present at once. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something shaped by everything that had been endured. As they stood there, still holding on, the reality settled in slowly. The waiting was over. What came next would ask for patience all over again. The waiting had finally ended, but standing together made it clear that ending wasn't the same as erasing. What followed was quieter, slower, and far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Reunions don't restore time. They introduce it again, carefully, like a language both sides have to relearn. The child stayed close at first, watching every movement, listening to every breath, as if afraid this closeness might vanish if it wasn't guarded. More than once, without thinking, the child kept a light grip on the edge of her sleeve, not tugging, just holding on, as if letting go would tempt the world to take something back. The mother noticed it immediately. She didn't rush. She didn't demand affection. She let trust arrive at its own pace. There were awkward moments. Names repeated too often, questions that landed wrong, silences that felt heavy but necessary. Love was there, undeniable, but it had to find new shapes. The years apart had changed them both. Accepting that truth was part of healing. Around them, life continued without ceremony. Papers were signed, instructions were given. People moved on to the next task, but for those reunited, time behaved differently. It slowed, it softened. It made room for small victories, shared meals, familiar gestures returning, laughter appearing where only restraint had lived before. The soldiers watched from a distance, satisfied in a way that didn't require recognition. One of them lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes resting on the pair as if quietly confirming the work had reached its destination. Then he turned away and kept walking, leaving the moment to belong to them. Years later, memories of that courtyard would blur at the edges. Details would fade, but the feeling wouldn't. The feeling of waiting ending, of hands finding each other again, of learning that even after deep loss, connection can return changed, imperfect, but real. Stories like this don't promise happy endings. They offer something quieter, proof that compassion can survive chaos, that patience, though painful, can lead somewhere meaningful, and that some moments are worth remembering, not because they were flawless, but because they were human. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who believes the past still matters. You're listening to History Captured, where moments like these are never forgotten.